So welcome everybody to this seminar from the Department of Educational Research at Lancaster University. It's great to have Carrie here today with us speaking on her work. I'll introduce her in a second, but first of all, just to say we are live streaming this, obviously, because you're on live stream, but we're also recording it, and so there'll be a recording made available afterwards as well. Carrie will speak for around 40 minutes, and then after that, there'll be an opportunity for questions. So you can ask questions either in person, verbally, or you can ask questions in the chat box, and then we'll read those out. Please make sure that you mute your microphones throughout the presentation to make it all very smooth. I think that's it in terms of housekeeping. So it's really great to have Carrie with us today. Carrie is director of the Nottingham Centre for Children, Young People and Families at Nottingham Trent University. She's started her career as a teacher of maths in various comprehensive schools in London before moving into academia and working at King's and the Open University, and most recently at Goldsmiths before moving to Nottingham. She's researched and published extensively on gender and education, and she'll be talking today about aspects of her most recent book with Anna Carlile, which was published by Routledge in 2018, entitled LGBTQI Parented Families and Schools, Visibility, Representation and Pride. And the title of the seminar is kind of similar, but LGBTQI plus parented families and schools. So, Carrie, if you're happy to take over, then welcome, and thank you for speaking to us today.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Carolyn. The reason why the book doesn't have the plus on it is to do with search engines. So we were advised to take the plus out when we had the book title. It's as simple as that. So I was asked to start by saying a bit about getting research funding and sort of ways of doing that. And a bit about my history of doing this. And my main history of getting research funding is I'm not very good at it. So I haven't really got any advice for people, except to say that this particular study, this book, is a really good example of how to do quite a lot of research on no money or virtually no money. And in fact, the genesis of the book was that Wayne Martineau, who had a book series, came to give a talk at Goldsmiths, and we went out to dinner with him afterwards, as you did in those times. And he said, I've got this series, how about a book? And Anna and I sort of looked at each other and went, well, we could write a book about LGBTQI plus parented families. And he went, yeah. And so we wrote a book proposal, but we hadn't actually done any research. So we then had to do the research. And it was quite problematic because I was head of department and she was head of the undergraduate programme, so we had no time and we had no funding. But we managed to do 5 different studies, which I'll talk about in a minute, only one of which ever had any funding. So this is an example of what you can do with nothing. And I think it's an important thing it's important to say that, because people often think that they can only do empirical research, or interviews or whatever, if they've got funding, and actually there's ways and means if you haven't. So the book is based, this talk is based on as Carolyn said, my jointly written book with Anna Carlile at Goldsmiths. And the book is based on 5 linked studies. So we did interviews with parents, interviews with children. We also did an analysis of all the school websites in 2 local authority areas. One was urban and one was rural. Plus, we did a survey of all the schools that were connected with Goldsmiths, which was a superb failure. We probably got 15 responses from 500 schools, which was a bit useless. But the school website analysis was really, really interesting. We did an analysis of print media. We picked, I think, 4 weeks over a calendar year to look at what was said about LGBTQI plus parents. And then Anna was asked to evaluate the Educate and Celebrate programme, and that was our sole source of funding. So that did actually pay her to go around the country and talk to schools, and I think a bit of transcription. And we got a little bit of money from transcription from the department in various ways, but that was sort of it. And because of that, we did lots of things that people didn't do so much pre-COVID. So our interviews were conducted in all sorts of different ways. So we did online interviews. We have a couple that are done by instant messaging. We were using Skype. We were using face-to-face. If we happen to be in a place, we do an interview. Anna was doing interviews on the back of the Educate and Celebrate travelling. So it was all sort of do what you can, but it meant we did actually have participants from all over England and Wales and a couple of other countries. So these are our interview respondents. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is the parent and child interviews. I can talk a bit about the other stuff, but the parent and child stuff for me certainly is the most interesting. So we did 23 parent interviews with 26 parents and carers. So in some cases, we interviewed two parents stroke carers together, but mainly they were single. We also did 19 child interviews, but they weren't all from the same families. So one way that we got child interviews was because Anna and her family go on Rainbow Camp every year. So some of these children were interviewed at Rainbow Camp. Often sort of, walking around with a tape recorder with the recorder in Anna's hand, and they'd be sort of walking around the campsite or walking by the river. So the child interview is quite interesting in that way. And we also did interview some children of the parents we interviewed. The people were located all over the place, from major cities to small villages, but they were mainly in England and Wales. Most of them were cisgender, but not all of them. Of those that didn't, we had 2 participants that identified as trans men, 4 as women of trans history, and these are very much participant chosen identities. So that's why we use that different language. 1 is genderqueer, 1 is non-binary, and 1 is intersex. And we didn't actually ask anybody about their sexual orientation. So, but some people told us. So one parent respondent said they were bisexual. One couple said they were polyamorous. One was a trans man parenting with a cis female partner who herself identified as a lesbian. One was one woman of trans history who was previously married to a cis woman is now in a heterosexual relationship. But there were other things going on. And as I said, we didn't ask. I'm not sure why we didn't ask, but we didn't. And we had various ways of identifying them. We had a Facebook page that we set up really early on, and we got some people from that. We did a certain amount of snowball sampling, asking people to suggest people. And then there was this Educate and Celebrate evaluation, which included one gay male parent head teacher, for example. So this is what the families were like. So we had 14 parent respondents who were parenting as a couple. And they might be birth children, adopted children, or foster children. There was quite a variety. We had quite a lot of foster children, more than one would normally expect, I think. There were 11 single parents, but some of them were co-parenting up to 50%. With ex-partners of one gender or another. The children were aged 2 to adult, but we only interviewed the ones of school age. So we didn't interview anyone under about 7, I think. And we didn't interview the adult children, but there were some children. Some people had children that were now adults. So 7 of these children were adopted, 4 were fostered, 11 were born into conventionally heterosexual families, and 1 was born to a trans man by donor insemination. And the others were born to lesbian or binary lesbian or intersex lesbian couples or single parents by donor insemination, which might or might not include IVF. And we didn't always know, we didn't ask, but sometimes people told us. So I'm going to talk now about the parents. and what the parents thought. And one of the themes that runs particularly strongly through the parent data is that they had strategies. Well, the whole idea of visibility and invisibility is a constant theme in the parent data, and they had various strategies for this. And I think it's important to be very clear that being visible and being out are not the same. And in some cases, as we'll see, being out was a strategy for basically trying to be relatively invisible. So being out could be a very good way of actually trying to be invisible. The other thing that was just quite amusing in some ways and quite nice in other ways was that people thought locality was important. So, but wherever they lived, they thought it was okay there. So people would say things like, so for example, there was one woman of trans history, recently transitioned, and she said, well, it's fine in the village, everyone knows me, it's not a problem. But if I lived in a small town, then, you know, it would be a very different thing. And then there was a gay male couple who had actually moved from London to a small town. And they said, oh, well, you know, whenever we walk outside the door in London, we suddenly became an issue. But in this small town, it's fine. We're just another family. And it was sort of like that anyway. There was one trans woman of trans history and her child who had had a lot of trouble in their village, but the child had subsequently moved to another very rural village where he was having no trouble at all. So, you know, again, mainly things were all right, but there was this general feeling of, you know, we're all right in the city, but if we moved to, we might be the only gay in the village or whatever. But actually, the people in the villages also thought it was fine, and the people in the suburbs thought it was fine. And there was a general sort of fear of everywhere else, but where we live is fine. There were 4 major visibility and invisibility strategies, which we saw, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. The first one was active visibility. So some people really worked on being visible. The second was an unwanted invisibility. So that's really the opposite of that. The people who would like to be invisible weren't. There were quite a number of people who just saw themselves as a family like any other, and that was their approach to things. And then there was a small group who were invisible but very precariously. And that was a very small group, but life was much harder for these people. So this is Jess. Jess is long-term fostering with her lesbian partner. She's a lesbian. And I've not ever met Jess face-to-face, but she says, as she's basically quite butch. She's got short hair, she's got tattoos, and she's parenting in a fairly rural community. And the child is in the same school she's always been in. So it's a working class community. Even though Jess and her partner are middle class and don't particularly live in that community. So she joins the PTA. And, you know, she said, I never thought I would join it, but I was very conscious about it because I wanted to be seen. And she's wanting to be seen in lots of different ways. She wants to say, look, you don't have to be like this. You can be, like, you know, a different way as a parent or a carer. You know, I've got tattoos and they're not the same as the other women at the school. And I wanted to be out as possible and have an aim. So she was very busy doing nice things for children as the lesbian on the, you know, the butch lesbian on the PTA. And that was a very conscious thing to do, partly to support her daughter and partly just to be different within the school. And so people who were actively visible, Jess was fairly typical of them. For them, this high visibility was really important. They all talked about it. And it wasn't always about sexual orientation. It was in some cases, it was about gender identities. So it was about showing a different gender identity. And And in some ways it was part of being visibly out and proud. That was one of the things that it was about. But there were other things going on as well, which I will talk about in a minute. So, for example, some people thought that given that their families were not typical of maybe their local area or their local community or whatever, it made it easier for children because then there was nothing for the children to explain. So, if their attitude was, we'll be completely upfront about this so that the children don't have to explain anything themselves. So, for example, the trans man who'd given birth to his child, everybody knew that, and I know, and we said, what do the other families know you as? And he said, oh, they know me as so-and-so's dad, but they also know I gave birth to him. And that was an important thing for this family, that meant that their child never had to explain anything because it was just always there, as an issue, no secrets. As I said, some people joined school governing bodies as parts of active visibility. People did it for other reasons as well, sometimes to support children with special needs or who'd been adopted. But it was also about saying, this group is important in the community and we have to represent them. One intersex respondent saw educating other parents about intersex as important, and they were concerned that their children's friends wouldn't understand, and their children's friends' parents wouldn't understand what they were and how they identified. And so they wrote a letter to parents that got sent out to all the parents in order to educate them. And there was a whole issue about not having secrets. So, if children had had a complex and problematic history, they wanted everything to be open. So Jess's daughter, for example, was still at the school she'd always been at, and they knew that other parents had seen her birth mother abusing her in the school community. So, there was this sort of attitude that she's got enough problems without having any secrets, so let's not have any. And that was something that foster parents, some foster parents in particular, were quite open about. So that's the visibly out and proud. And the flip side of this is unwanted invisibility. And for some of those people, being visibly out and proud was a strategy to avoid this unwanted invisibility. And I'll start with a quotation from Sylvie. Sylvie's non-binary, and Sylvie presents in very masculine ways. So Sylvie is often mistaken for a man and quite likes that. But there are times. So on this occasion is a pre-entry meeting for parents of year 7. And Sylvie's sitting there with their lesbian partner with their partner who's quite feminine. So they look like a conventional heterosexual couple. And they've since split up, but, and so what happens is someone says, sir, what's your question? And they've just been read as a heterosexual couple. And although Sylvie likes being read as a man and quite enjoys that, in this situation, they want to be read as queer and they want to disrupt, and they're just not able to disrupt in this situation. So they become invisible and they're not comfortable about that. So this unwanted invisibility was particularly problematic if you're like Sylvie and you are perceived as being part of a straight couple. People did not like that at all. And I think, and that's reasonable. You can understand why people would having broken away from sort of the het world, the straight world, you really wouldn't want to be constantly assumed that you were actually straight. So that was a problem. And it could lead, as I said, to people attempting to be very actively visible. It was another way of doing it. It could lead to some sort of fun and games as well. Sylvie told me a lovely story about being on a school trip with their child when their child was a nursery trip. So the child was very young, and all the other parents and the nursery staff, or certainly the other parents on the trip, thought that Sylvie was the dad, and Sylvie's child and Sylvie's child's close friends all knew otherwise, and they just all kept quiet about it, and it was a sort of funny secret that they were all going. So you could do those things as well, but generally people just try to be actively visible. Single parents have to come out explicitly if they want to be seen. So if you're a single parent, everyone will just assume you're a straight single parent. And so people have to sort of actively, very actively come out and repeatedly do it. So that can be a problem. Lesbians who've got former male partners and go to parents' evenings with them because they're the child's other parent, or one of the children's other parents, they're again invisible, particularly in that context. Parents who weren't the main carer became very invisible. We interviewed one woman who had split up with her child's birth mother, and the birth mother had moved back to her village of origin where she wasn't out, and trying to be visible to the school in those circumstances when the birth mother was sort of, removing things from the school record and denying her existence. That was very problematic. But the most frequent invisible parents are involved donor fathers, and they're invisible to us too because we actually didn't interview any, although we could have done. I mean, we probably could have been put in touch with involved donor fathers if we thought to ask, but we didn't, which is an interesting failing of our research, but points out how invisible those men are. Being invisible could mean that homophobia wasn't dealt with rapidly and appropriately because schools would think there were no children from LGBTQI plus parented families in the school. So they wouldn't necessarily realise quite how pertinent homophobia was, particularly in primary schools, or how important it was to have inclusive materials. They were waiting for a child to be in the school and they hadn't noticed they had one. So the third strategy is just a family like any other. And we had a number of parents who just really didn't think that any of this was much of an issue. So Simon, who's a gay single dad of an adopted child, just says, I don't think I've had any experiences as a gay parent. I'm a parent and these things happen. And, he had all sorts of other problems, like being the man in the playground, which is a sort of common problem that he talks to the man in the playground. But it wasn't because he was gay, it's just because he was a man in a playground with a load of mums. And Rachel, who's very much, who just said at one point, well, this is just my life, comes out quite deliberately to be a family like any other. So she says, oh, my partner, she does this. But she also, it's all about coming out really early because she wants, if people are homophobic, they can just decide to diss me now. So she's very proactive, but they're proactive as a family to just be invisible. So these parents, as I said, they wanted to be seen and treated by the school as ordinary parents with ordinary families. So they were quite homonormative in that way. Their families were, they were generally two parents and one or more children, and it was all quite conventional in that sense. And they wanted to be treated like any other family. And they really just thought society had moved on and it wasn't an issue, or it shouldn't be an issue. And so, as I said, they came out early on. They just wanted to get it out of the way. They had other things they were more concerned with in terms of their children's education. But they did things like talking frequently about their partner. So one of the things that that people did. So actually, just from the first example, she might be very visible, but her partner was not, because her partner went out to work, and so when the school approached her about something, she would say, "I will have to talk it over with my partner and see what she thinks." There was a sort of real emphasis about equal co-parenting, and that was something that Rachel and her partner did too. Although Rachel also said that she thought it took quite a long time for the other parents to realise there were two of them, because they were both sort of medium. Everybody just thinks of you as so-and-so's mum, and they were both similar height with similar hair. And somebody else said, "Oh yeah, they see a child and they see a hand holding the child. They don't really notice what you look like." And you know, a couple of lesbian couples complained that or said, quite amused, that, you know, somebody would say something to them in the afternoon that referred to something in the morning that had actually been going on with their partner, and nobody had noticed that there was a different parent there now. They had this real strategy of modelling visible ordinariness by behaving like a heterosexual couple in public, although it wasn't always clear how accurate that was. One gay couple said, "Oh, well, you know, I'll touch his shoulder and so on. And I'm not absolutely, you know, I'll hold his hand." I'm not sure how many straight parents go to parents' evening holding hands, but they felt that this was sort of behaving as very ordinary. They certainly didn't hide in any way. None of these people hid the fact that they were LGBTQI plus parents. And the other thing was that they left campaigning to others, and sometimes they might intend to raise issues. So one parent said to me, "Oh yes, every so often I go and look up lots of resources and I make a list to take into the school, but you know, there's only so many times you can contact your child's school effectively, and usually what really matters at that point is why aren't they learning their times tables? So it just gets pushed down." So they did have sort of sense that, yeah, there ought to be better resource and so on, but actually other things mattered to them more. And one parent said, you know, they wanted me on the bus at Pride, but I'm not going to do that. That's not what I do. You know, it was very much we're just living our lives and getting on with it. And just as a sort of footnote to this, most parents did things like, you know, when their child was 4 and was about to start primary school, they'd go into the school together and they'd come out to the school officially. But occasionally they never had a chance. And there was one parent I interviewed who had started fostering 2 children who were already at school at half term, and they were already at the same school, and they just turned up to pick them up. And they didn't have a meeting with the school for several weeks. So, you know, they'd sort of, you know, been in the playground with the other parents going, "Who are these people?" You know, this is another family who fostered children whose birth parents were known in the community as problematic. And they never really came out officially to the school or that clearly to anyone. They just sort of got on with it. And you know, it sort of negated it. That knowledge that could happen is sort of interesting, juxtaposed with what we know that parents with children starting school tend to do before school starts. And the final group were precariously invisible. They really wanted to be invisible, but their invisibility was really precarious. And Adele is a really good example of this. She's a woman of trans history, and she does go to school, but she absolutely makes herself look like a stereotypical feminine, and she's always worried. And she has 2 birth children, one of whom at that point was living with her. The other one was probably going to live with her, and they'd moved area, and she wasn't out at all in her new local area, and she was also now in a relationship with a man. So she actually would go to parents' evening with the man, which made her look, you know, they just looked like a straight couple, I think. Well, you know, which they were. But for Adele, it was always very precarious, and she was always worried about being outed. So this category only applied to 3 people. So 2 women of trans history and 1 trans man. And invisibility was ever so important to them because they were not out in their communities, and they were very worried about being discriminated against, having attacks and so on them and on their children. The trans man was out to the school, but only because in the country he lives in, it's on the official documentation. And he was another parent who'd given birth to this child, although I think in a heterosexual relationship. So it was on the official documentation that he was the birth parent. And the major thing, it was really not so much about themselves, it was fear that children would be bullied. So they were, so Adele, for example, her son was already being bullied because he was a bit fat. And she just didn't want anything else to happen to him. That was, as far as she was concerned, it was all about protecting her child. And that was generally what happened. And we interviewed another woman of trans history who had not come out at all to anybody until her children had grown up. And that was because as a teenager, she'd been caught cross-dressing by her schoolmates. And she'd been very badly bullied, and she just didn't want that for her children. So they were adults. And in fact, one of them was living on the other side of the world before she actually came out. And one person we interviewed told us of another woman of trans history who never went near her children's school, which of course is really problematic because it means that the school don't have parental input, and the child's not supported by the parent through those sorts of visits. But she felt, I think it was just too dangerous for her child to be spotted. And it was very, very stressful. And it meant that that their children's lives and their lives were just not recognised in the school at all. Some other issues that the parents raised. One was official forms. They frequently assume a mother and a father, or they have first parent and second parent, and people find this quite offensive. And a lot of them are local authority based. So Sylvia and her partner spent quite a lot of time talking to the school about the forms, but actually it was their local authority that provided this form and they couldn't do anything about it. The school couldn't do anything about it, but people got very upset about it. Children also need to have support, particularly young ones, to really legitimate all their parents. So Rachel, for example, her son came home when he was about 5 or 6 with a sort of diagram that they'd done in school called something like circles of influence or circles of importance. And it had, the people that were important, most important to you in the middle and less important as it went out. And his birth mother, who was not Rachel, was in the centre, his mummy. And Daddy was in there somewhere, and Rachel was completely invisible, just wasn't there. And she said, well, he will have looked around, everybody else was writing Mummy and Daddy. And nobody said to him, what about Rachel? And so it just didn't go in. And that makes her non-legitimate as a parent, and that's problematic. Mother's Day and Father's Day was a massive issue. It's known to be an issue, but I actually didn't ask people about it. I waited for them to raise it because they all did. And it's a complete minefield for schools, Mother's Day and Father's Day. So several of the female couples said things like, well, I don't know why we even bother with Father's Day. Lots of children don't have fathers. But of course, the male parents, the fathers, thought it was quite important to have Father's Day, and they were all right about Mother's Day generally. They sort of recognised that it was an issue, something that that a lot of families wanted. But even even the most sympathetic male couple said, they do Father's Day very well, but on Mother's Day they have a stall so that the children can buy presents. They don't do a stall on Father's Day. And so there was a still sense that it was unequal. And it was, schools are not bad at this now. They give you an opportunity to make a card for somebody else that's important for you if there isn't a mother or a father around. But parents complain, where there were 2 same-gender parents complained that the school wasn't giving their child a chance to make 2 cards. And children would stay in at break to make the second card and so on. So it was all quite problematic. Everybody got very hot under the collar about it. Use of mummy as a generic term is a real problem for lesbian couples in nurseries, with nurseries. We didn't have any male couples who had children that young, so it may well be a problem for them as well. But what happens in nursery education usually is, you know, a parent shows up and they say, "Oh, look, your mum is here." And for children of straight families, there's a mummy and there may or may not be a daddy, but what there aren't is a mummy and a mama. And in a lesbian family, mummy is somebody's name. So if somebody says to a child, "Oh, look, your mum is here," and actually that's the mummy called mama, that's actually quite confusing for the child. And one parent complained that their small child has started calling her daddy because she was the one that wasn't mummy. And that's something that carers and providers for young children need to get their heads around, that you can't just use mummy as a generic term, or daddy, actually, if you've got small children with 2 dads. So that's the parents' voices. I'm now going to talk a bit about the children's. So one thing that was very clear was that most of the children we interviewed were proud of their families. So Isla, whose mother had not been out for very long, year or so, was desperate to go to Pride. She had a lovely time at Pride. So she was very much about, I want to show people I'm not ashamed of my mum. Ada liked the idea that you were a bit different. And that was quite not uncommon. You know, I'm just not identical to everyone else. I don't really enjoy being like everyone else. And that was quite common, that children liked the sense. There would come a point when children liked the sense of being different. They didn't always like it. And children also had some quite weird views about the advantages. We did ask them very explicitly, what are the advantages and disadvantages of being from an LGBTQI plus family. So Riley thought that you get all the love from your mum. So you get twice the love if you have 2 mums. I don't know what she thought happened to people with 2 dads, but she basically said all the love comes from the mum, so you get more. And another child, I think it was another child, said, "Oh, well, you know, men and women fight all the time, but girls don't fight. So there's much less fighting in a lesbian family," which that's not what the evidence says, but anyway. But they there were all sorts of, stereotypes got in the middle of this, and that was one. As they got older, quite often having LGBTQI plus parents was seen as cool. So Ethan's dad's only just come out as trans. And this is just in passing, this is quite common terminology that children whose certainly whose fathers transition carry on calling them dad, but she. And Ethan did that, and so did one of the other children we interviewed. And Ethan's friends think it's cool. Ethan's brother's friends know less about it, and they're younger, and but we didn't interview Ethan's brother. And Sylvie talks about her son walking home with girls across the park, and it's so cool to have 2 mums. Because if you had 2 dads, that was even cooler. So as a teenager, it can be really cool. And Rachel thought that her son's friends really, really, a bit like the little girl who thought you got all the love, they would really like to have 2 mummies, because, it was 2 people as close as your mummy is. So Rachel also thought that her child's friends, we didn't interview this child, liked having 2 mummies. On the other hand, they all complained, or most, not all of them, most of them complained about gay as being a term of abuse, and they approached it in different ways. So some children were very clear that they wanted to confront it. So Jad, who was interviewed with their non-binary parent, so who's really quite activist. So Jad would have been quite difficult for Jad not to say I'd confront it, but Jad confronts it and is proud of confronting it. This is also the case of Piero, who, you know, I think they can obviously see the wrong answer isn't going to go well for them. You know, he's quite assertive in his response to people using the word gay as a term of abuse. But Isla just said, it's just awful, but you can't just challenge everybody all the time. So that's one problem that people have. And a lot of schools, particularly secondary schools, you know, gay is used as a term of abuse all the time. And if you challenge it all the time, there's just going to be nobody to talk to about it. Now, Isla's younger brother said he challenged it a lot more. And it may depend on your sort of, you know, your own social standing, what you can get away with challenging. But Isla found it very difficult. And Ted is living with two lesbian parents and a sister and a female cat, and he's 16. And he really feels he's living in a female world and he's the only man. And he can't quite hack any of this. So he does actually join in with homophobic language. And also one of the younger children had been disciplined by the school for using gay as a term of abuse. And he just said, it doesn't mean gay. So there were some people who just felt the pressure to participate. And I think that, you know, it was sad, really, that a child like Ted felt that. And Ted would also skulk around at parents' evening and not join his parents until most of his friends had gone home for the same reason. And Sylvie was moderately unusual, I think. I felt that a lot of the parents expected their children to challenge homophobic comments. And Sylvie, who had been a teacher, said, well, you know, you can't fight all those battles. Sometimes it's not so safe. And tried to make it possible for her children to feel they didn't have to challenge everything all the time. Some children were bullied. There wasn't a lot of it, but it did happen. So Piero's dad came out as trans, and it caused havoc because there were a couple of parents who were awful. I mean, they were very confronting. They would tell their kids not to play with Piero, and they also bullied Piero a lot. This was some time ago. So we interviewed Piero when he was 12, and this was happening when he was about 6. And in the end, it was only because his mother moved house that he got away from this. That was very, very problematic. And Riley got bullied by someone that had 2 dads, which, as you said, is just unacceptable, really. So there was a sort of, you know, something was obviously going on with this child who had 2 dads that made her feel that, or made them feel that they had to bully Riley. But, you know, it did sometimes happen, not very often, but it did sometimes happen. Children were bullied. There was a tendency to have to educate others about your family, which people found really, really, really annoying. And for me, it's a very good reason why we need to educate younger children about LGBTQI plus parented families. So John said, people ask, how are you even alive if you only have 2 mums? And you have to answer them, you know. So that was sort of, John was just, you know, that was John's complaint, basically. People ask these stupid questions, you have to deal with it. And then Kelly, you know, they don't understand how I don't have a dad. And she has to explain about having a donor dad. And one of the parents complained that their child had been told by another parent, everybody has a dad. And this child didn't have a dad, she had a donor. So that invisible, the invisibility of the dad can be quite problematic if schools don't explain this to children. And I haven't put the name of this person, but one of the children, I think that's right. Oh no, that's right. He has two things. So Nick, people ask things like, "Were you born half in one and half in the other?" And Nick also complained that that other children sometimes said, "No, you got it wrong. One of them's just a childminder." And so having to explain that could be really, really problematic. And actually, Rachel complained as well that some parents at the school, before they were out, would think that one of them was the nanny. There was a mum and a nanny. So having to sort of explain that, no, these people are both my parents was problematic and annoying, and it started when they were 4 or 5. So you need to actually do that education really young. So some conclusions. One is that most parents and most children were out at school to some extent, but it varied. And people didn't always have complete control over how out they were. Partly because children talk about the family. Being open with the school was usually unproblematic, and it usually made it easier to deal with problems immediately. Children from LGBTQI plus parented families are very aware of homophobia, and they're often upset by it, and schools don't do enough about it. And quite often, one of the interesting things about Isla's parent was that she worked in the school and she was much less aware of what was going on in the school in terms of homophobic language than Isla was. So it's clear that school staff are less aware of what's going on than young people are, and that needs to be dealt with. And because of all of this, all schools need to be inclusive, because not all LGBTQI plus families, parented families, are obvious. They're not always visible to the school. And there is a tendency, particularly in primary schools, to wait until that child comes along, or and again, particularly in secondary schools, to focus all inclusivity on, say, gay and trans teenagers, and to forget that there's these parents that are in the background. As I said, you need to educate children from a really early age about LGBTQI plus parented families. When I did the review of the local authority, of the school websites, I found one school that said explicitly, and it was a Church of England school as it happened, that they taught children how lesbians had babies, but they didn't do it till year 6. But at least they did it, but they didn't do it till year 6. And by then, any child in the school who's got 2 mums is going to have been asked an awful lot of questions. And schools just generally need to think about how their practices may impact on these families, and be aware that some things are not immediately obvious. Things that they take for granted will actually be quite problematic for families. And that's it. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carrie. That was absolutely fascinating, really interesting, and I know, it's not easy presenting on Zoom, because you've got a screen of yourself and your slides, and you can't get the. It's very different, isn't it, from doing it in a room? But that was just really great, and lots of food for thought. It struck me that one of the things, there's lots of positives in your accounts, quite a few negatives, but just for everybody, the kind of emotional labour that goes on through it all seemed to be, really notable.
Yeah. The emotional labour is constant, and it's emotional labour of 5-year-olds. It goes all, from the day you get to school. One of John's parents pointed out that they'd mainly mixed with other lesbian families before he went to school. So until he went to school, he just thought he thought that an awful lot of families had 2 mums, and it wasn't unusual. And then he goes to school and, you know, and people are saying, how can you exist? How are you even alive? And that's a problem.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got plenty of time for questions now, about half an hour or so, if people want to ask them. So you can post your questions in the chat, or you can just unmute your mics and ask them, and that'd be really nice if people want to do that, because we'll get to see some more faces here. But a lot, I guess you can see the chat, Carrie. Basically,
I can't see any questions in the chat.
No questions yet, just lots of compliments and saying how interesting it was, and really enjoyed it. So, so has anybody got any questions?
Yes, maybe I have one, but I can't start my video for some reason, so you will have to do it just with the audio.
Okay, go on, Mika.
Yeah, I was just wondering whether you could say that also the children are having some kind of visibility strategies, because we always use we do at least the concept of a visibility strategy for the adults themselves, the LGBTQ parents. But I was wondering, when you were telling your story, well, we could say that the children themselves also have some visibility strategies.
Yes, or invisibility strategies.
Yeah.
I mean, I think for a lot of the children, visibility came as soon as the child came home, you know, as soon as a visiting child came home. So John's parents said, oh, yes, his friend came round when he was 5 and he looked round the house and he said, no dad's here. And they went, and we said, no dad's. And he went, oh, okay. So there was, you know, a lot of it was to do with who you brought home. So choosing who you brought home. Ted, who's the one who tries to avoid letting anyone know his parents are lesbians, made friends with a girl from a religious community and wanted to bring her home to visit. And the parents said, don't you think you better tell her that we're lesbians, because her parents might not like it? And he went, oh, yeah, all right, and sent a text. And in fact, the parents were fine, and she came over and it was all fine. So I think, I think the children are using different strategies, and it depends on the child and it depends on their circumstances at the time. So some of them probably will have visibility strategies. I mean, I know, you know, I know myself, I've got a lesbian mum, and of course I'm old. So it's, you know, it's a very different set of circumstances. I wasn't out of school at all. But as soon as I went to university, I told absolutely everybody. And it was, you know, so it was just a change of circumstances, right? At school, it was going to be a real problem. At university, it made me unusual. So, you know, I do think that's part of what they're doing, that children and young people are quite strategic about what's visible and what's not. Although, when you're young, I think it's just these are my mums, or these are my dads. And children have different attitudes. We interviewed 2 little boys who had 2 dads, and they had been adopted in the previous couple of years, and we said, what's good about having gay dads? And they went, you have a family and they love you. And that was sort of it. You know, the gay bit wasn't really an issue. It was a family and they love you. And that was what mattered to those children. And you know, different children will have different reactions. Melis has got your hand up.
Yeah, the questions are coming thick and fast, so let's take one from Melis and then go to the...
Okay.
Hello, so thank you very much for this fascinating presentation. I mean, there's so much interesting data and exciting data coming out there, which I just want to ask so many questions. But if to start with, I was wondering if there were any collective alliance among these parents to challenge some of the stereotypical or some of this heteronormative understandings of family within the schools. You mentioned about one family sending out letters, which I find really important in terms of challenging the discourse of heteronormativity, but I was wondering if there is a collective alliance, what you could call it, feminist alliance among parents to, this could be in the form of an ethical responsibility to sort of influence the school environment, to educate people about different ways of families are set up. So, I mean, this is because they, it might be quite uncomfortable for some parents, but then it again falls on the LGBT families to change these.
Yeah, I think one of the things was that for most of the families, they weren't necessarily the only LGBTQ plus parented family in the school, but they often didn't know any others. And we did ask the children, is there somebody else in your school who you think might have, come from an LGBTQI plus family? And they would go, oh, well, yeah, maybe there's somebody in, in year 4. And it was only, there were a couple in an inner city who did know others. But it was one of those areas where you might have more of those sorts of families living, if you see what I mean. But generally, there wasn't anyone to have an alliance with. You tended, you might well be the only parent or the only parent with a child in that year group. So there wasn't a lot of alliance in that sense. And gay teachers only sometimes wanted to ally. It's quite difficult being a gay teacher. Not all gay teachers are out, and there's good reasons for that. So I think the answer is no. The ones that were actively visible were often networked into other organisations, to organisations which helped them being actively visible in other ways, and they were campaigning. Some of our parents were active campaigners, but particularly the ones that just wanted to be a parent like any other. That wouldn't have been what they wanted to do, because they were, where they allied with other parents, it was about times tables and fighting in the playground. It wasn't about LGBTQI plus issues.
Thanks, Carrie. If we look at the chat now, and maybe I'll pick a few out for you to respond to. So, first question from Alex: Did any parents reflect that their actual experiences were different to those they imagined? It seems perhaps their parental identity became stronger than their sexual or gender identity? ?
Not in that sense. But yes, I mean, I think that is true for quite a lot of the parents, but some of those parents were like that anyway. I mean, I think Rachel and her partner, they'd just always seen themselves as just a couple. But what did happen was that parents were often really fearful about choosing a school. And they said things like, well, obviously we didn't look at any church schools. And actually, I mean, there was some really quite interesting things being done in the, by some C of E schools, in the certainly on paper, in the school document survey. So people would be very careful about how they chose a school, and then once the child was settled, they'd be a lot less worried, and they'd just sort of get on with it. So it was that first couple of years, and the parents of the very young child had moved the child's nursery from one which was very supportive to one that was more convenient but was quite problematic. And for example, used mummy as a generic and didn't understand why that was a problem. So I think if they could settle and they didn't feel there were any problems, then parents, what mattered was the parent identity. But sometimes other things would come in, and if you were an activist anyway, you were an activist anyway.
Okay, thanks. A question from Utsa, who says it was wonderful, thank you, and asked about ethnicity and whether ethnicity was something you explored and whether it inflected the experiences of visibility, invisibility and bullying.
That was quite complicated, and we tried quite hard to find non-white parents, and we only had one parent who was black, and she was invisible because she was single. So So that was a sort of interesting situation. We had quite a lot of, not quite a lot, we had a reasonable proportion of the children were not white. For various reasons, you know, well, yeah, for various reasons. It didn't seem to be an issue. It was more, I mean, where we really saw intersectional stuff was where children were adopted or fostered. And children, so for example, the two gay men said, well, the older one, you know, he's been having a lot of trouble at school. He was bullied when we first moved here, but that was because he was adopted, not because he's got gay dads. And so there were those sorts of things going on, but it wasn't generally about ethnicity.
Okay, thanks. From Sally, I think you might have kind of touched upon this in relation to Melissa's question, but she was asking whether you interviewed people from towns or villages where they've got large lesbian populations like Todmorden or Hebden Bridge, and whether that influenced the experiences. No, we didn't. We did interview a dad from Brighton, but no, they were in ever such, I mean, apart from this one inner city area, it was ever so sort of typical, but just, I mean, they were a bit random, but they weren't in any of those sorts of bits of the country like Hebden Bridge. They were in, you know, they often, I mean, you know, they often were the only gay in the village, or the only trans in the, you know, only trans person in the village. And that, yeah, it was definitely not those sorts of groups, and we worked quite hard to not interview from those areas, actually. But as it happened, nobody volunteered. So,
sorry, Carrie, could I ask why did you not want to interview people from areas like that? Was there a reason for that?
I think we wanted a more typical experience. I think it's,
okay.
You know, I think it's very different if you live somewhere like Hebden Bridge or Brighton.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And yeah, we wanted to know what it's like if you're in suburban Birmingham or rural Essex or, you know, darkest Gloucestershire or Manchester, you know.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, Sue's asking whether there are issues of children bringing different values into the home and challenging their parents' values.
Well, apart from the child who got punished at school for using gay as a term of abuse and going, why is this an issue? The only child who really did that was Ted, and that was, I think, was part of Ted's general adolescence. I mean, the parents said things like, he says terrible, challenging things, but he's just being challenging. He was 16. You know, he was 16. He was having a difficult adolescence, and he was in this, you know, he said things like, they're all women, even the cat. And so, no, apart from that, they didn't generally. And most of the children were very supportive of their parents in lots of ways. I'm very proud. It was, you know, it was unusual for there to be anything other. And that was, you know, I do think there were some differences in the interview responses that I got and Anna got. I mean, a lot of the children that Anna interviewed knew she was lesbian and knew her children, or had met her children. And I'm much more straight presenting, and I'm straight. And they weren't, and the children I interviewed didn't know me at all. They didn't know anything about me. So I think, you know, there was no expectation that I would expect them to behave or say things in, particular ways, which I think was the case more for Anna. But she, on the other hand, it was Anna that interviewed Ted and managed to reassure him that he could say anything he liked, and it wouldn't be repeated. And you know, he was quite vociferous in some ways about how embarrassing he found the whole thing.
Thanks very much, Carrie. I'm Sue Cranmer. I just wanted to, I just remember a friend of mine getting on a bus, and there was a female driver, and this 4-year-old going, well, you can't drive the bus, you're a woman. And my friend thinking, where on earth has he got that from? Yeah. You know, and I'm just thinking, obviously, that children learn so much at school, they then bring it into the home, you know. But you've answered that, thank you. That's where I was coming from with that. Not that they were trying not to be supportive to the parents, but they just, you know, have a whole different set of ideas.
I think it was John said to me, people ask me who plays football with me, you know, who's doing that? Who's doing the dad stuff? And he said, well, my mum does, she's not any good. So there were sort of, you know, other children, they did have these quite gendered expectations about what was missing if you didn't have a dad, for example.
Okay,
lovely, thank you.
Keep going because they keep coming in thick and fast. So if anybody wants to, if anybody's posted them in the chat and they prefer to ask it in person, then please do. Emma's asking, did you find any difference between schools where there were lots of social families to those where they were mainly biological? I found where there were lots of children with lots of step or half or multiple parents, children didn't think anything of two mums or two dads because to them everyone has multiple adults with those names.
We didn't know enough about the schools, so we didn't interview anybody in the schools. We just interviewed the parents and the children. So I don't know. What I do know, I mean, one thing that Rachel said was, well, his best friend, he and his best friend both go and see their dads in South London at weekends. You know, and the best friend is from a straight couple that's split up. And so there were things in common like that that made it, you know, this is normal life where we go and see dad at weekends. So I don't know, but people didn't comment on that. And people were in very, very different school situations and living situations.
Okay. A question about whether anyone addressed that representation might make it easier for gay children to accept themselves.
Yes, that was one reason why some parents were so busy being out and proud. So the gay dads in particular was part of what they were trying to do. The gay male couple were trying to show a really, you know, they both had quite traumatic youths themselves, and they were very keen to show that you can have a really happy life with nice children and so on, and a nice partner and be gay. And that partly came from one of them having been a teacher. So there was a certain amount of modelling in that way, and modelling different ways. So Jess, who we saw at the beginning, you know, she wanted to be seen to be, you can be a really nice person and very butch. And it's definitely some of this was about sort of showing children that it was all right. But interestingly, we interviewed, occasionally Anna interviewed children with their parents. And she interviewed a non-binary child with a non-binary parent, and the non-binary parent had split up from their partner, who was a teacher in the child's school and wasn't out. And they had an argument in the middle of the interview about whether teachers should come out or not. And the parent was saying, yes, gay teachers have a duty to come out as a role model, and, you know, and so on and so forth. And the child was just going, no, you can't always do that. It's not always safe. And so it was discussed, but it was discussed in quite, you know, in varying different ways. And of course, the people that just thought, well, you know, we're a family like any other, they didn't think that there was anything to show, really, you know.
Thank you. Do you have suggestions on how LGBT parents could speak to schools to influence the school environments and to promote culture of inclusion?
I think it's useful if parents can start explaining to school what are the things that make them feel excluded, like these forms and like the mummy thing. I think just saying, look, can we talk about what makes us and what makes our children feel excluded? And also pointing to materials, you know, there's the Educate and Celebrate stuff, there's the No Outsiders stuff. There's a lot of material around at the moment which parents could recommend to schools.
Okay, thanks, Carrie. Was there a difference between experiences of children and parents in schools who had taken part in Educate and Celebrate and those who hadn't?
We didn't compare. I don't think, actually, apart from the parent that was the head of an Educate and Celebrate school, we actually had anyone in an Educate and Celebrate school. So we wouldn't be able to tell you.
Okie doke.
The numbers aren't big enough, really, to measure those sorts of differences.
And the last question that's there at the moment is, again, a thank you for an interesting presentation. Wondering if the analysis of school websites you did, whether you found any examples of good practice that could be linked with parents being more visible or included?
Not much. I mean, they were awful, mainly. They were just grim, actually. I found the whole thing very depressing. There were a couple of notable things. One was this one C of E primary school that taught year sixes how lesbians have babies. I were very explicit about it. It was the only time I saw it anywhere. There was one of the schools associated with Goldsmiths had a centres of absolutely fantastic borough policy. But generally, they were awful. And I even found one that was still talking about within the parameters of Section 28. So a lot of the stuff hadn't been updated for years. The only sex and relationship education policies that mentioned love were from religious schools, mainly, particularly the Roman Catholic schools talked about love quite a lot. But generally the policies were awful. They tended to be, I've got some sympathy. I've been a school governor, and you've got hundreds of these blooming policies that you have to have, and this is just one of them, or just three of them, really. Often all the LGBT stuff was in the anti-bullying policy, so there was a real assumption that the only issue was that children might be bullied, and actually that isn't the only issue, and often it's not the issue. So that was one thing. There was very little addressing of LGBTQI plus issues, and where it was about gay children, gay young people, not parents. So parents were just, LGBTQI plus parents were completely invisible in most of the policies. There was a tendency to get your policy from the local authority, and they often had some really weird statements in them, like one of them said something like, school culture is how well we get on with each other. And that was just repeated, school after school after school. They would be, on the website, complete with the yellow highlighting that said, insert good example of school's action here. So they'd obviously, they'd take a policy with all the gaps to be filled in, not fill in any gaps. Or they would say this will be reviewed annually, and it was quite clear that it had been uploaded 5 years ago. Nobody had looked at it. There was one, it was particularly common in academy chains that one school would have a really good policy that had clearly actually been acted. There was one in particular where a school had obviously done a lot of work on its policy, and it was all very relevant to the school, and then it had been picked up wholesale by another school in the chain for whom it was irrelevant, it just wasn't appropriate. And there was one absolutely awful one that had clearly got their policy from a boarding school, and it talked about non-existent boarders and matron. So mainly they're examples of really dreadful practice, I would say. There's not a lot. And local authorities, in the two local authorities I was looking at, were not that helpful. But we did see one really good one from London.
Okay, thank you. And that's all questions in the chat. I can't see any hands up, but there's still a few minutes if somebody wants to ask another question. But as I say, lots of thank yous in the chat as well, Carrie.
Yes, that's nice. Thank you, everyone. It's really nice to talk about this again. I haven't talked about this for a while, so I'm talking about it again tomorrow at work. So I'm having a little phase of LGBTQI plus parented families.
Good. Are there any more Any more before we finish?
Oh, where do I see I'm moving away from this. Anna is still working a lot in this area. Anna's been doing a lot of work. We've both moved much more into trans issues. So Anna's been doing work for mermaids and with mermaids. So that's what she's been doing. And she's still doing Educate and Celebrate work. So she subsequently brought out a how-to book for schools with Ellie Barnes of Educate and Celebrate. And then she's brought out a sort of advisory document on dealing with these issues in religious schools. So that's what she's done. And now, she's doing a lot of work with mermaids. I've done sort of quite a lot more trans stuff. I'm just about to publish a paper on non-binary young people in schools, because very little work's been done on non-binary youth. But I'm about to start a new project on girl skateboarders, so I'm not going to be doing this stuff for a while.
That sounds great. I can't wait to hear about that when you get going.
Yeah, but Anna's done quite a lot more of this sort of work. It's actually more her mainstream thing than it's my mainstream thing, really.
Okay, well, unless anybody else has got any more questions, I would like to thank everybody for attending and for your questions and your engagement, and obviously in particular to Carrie for doing a great session and sharing your fantastic work with us, Carrie. So thank you so much for that. The recording will be available to others later on afterwards, so you can watch again or let people know. I know there were lots of people contacted me and said that they couldn't be here now, but they were looking forward to reading it watching it afterwards. So we'll make that available. So thank you again, Carrie, and thanks to everybody, and have a good afternoon.
Yes, thanks for inviting me.